Most people believe an empath is defined by sensitivity, by softness, by emotional openness. But what most people don't see is that beneath that sensitivity, there is a constant, silent analysis happening, a continuous decoding of human behavior that never fully turns off. The empath doesn't just feel emotions, they map them. And this is where it begins to shift, because what looks like compassion on the surface is often something far more complex underneath. It looks like they are simply listening, but internally they are tracking inconsistencies. It looks like patience, but internally they are measuring emotional patterns across time. It looks like forgiveness, but internally they are storing data they will never speak about. And most people mistake this silence for innocence, but internally something else is happening. There is a quiet accumulation, not of anger, not even of pain in the way people assume, but of awareness. The empath notices the tone shift that didn't match the words. They notice the delay before a response that felt slightly calculated. They notice when someone's behavior subtly changes depending on what they can gain. And they don't react. That's the part people misunderstand the most. The lack of reaction is not a lack of awareness. It's controlled observation. Because reacting would interrupt the pattern, and the empath is not focused on the moment. They are focused on the pattern behind the moment. And this creates an internal tension that most people will never fully understand, because the empath is feeling everything while simultaneously holding it back. They are absorbing emotional signals while analyzing them in real time. They are present, but also slightly removed, watching, processing, connecting. And over time, this creates a very specific kind of pressure. Not loud, not explosive, but constant. Because when you see patterns others don't see, you can't unsee them. When you feel emotional shifts others ignore, you can't ignore they anymore. And the empath learns something very early, even if they can't fully articulate it yet, that people don't always mean what they say. And more importantly, they repeat who they are. Not once, not occasionally, consistently. And this is where the dark side begins to form, not as a reaction, but as a result of prolonged exposure to patterns that don't align with words. Because the empath keeps giving the benefit of the doubt. At first it feels like compassion. Then it becomes curiosity. Then it slowly turns into quiet verification. They start replaying conversations, not because they're insecure, but because something didn't fully match. A phrase felt slightly off. A reaction came too quickly or too late. And they revisit it not emotionally, but analytically, trying to understand what was really happening beneath the surface. And most people never realize this is happening, because externally, nothing changes. The empath still listens, still responds calmly, still appears, understanding. But internally, something is starting to separate. Not in a dramatic way, in a precise way. They begin to distinguish between what is said and what is consistently shown, between emotional expressions and behavioral patterns. And once that distinction starts forming, it doesn't stop, because clarity, once introduced, expands quietly. And this is where it becomes dangerous, not for others at first, but for the empath themselves, because now they are carrying two realities at the same time. The reality of what people present and the reality of what people reveal through repetition. And those two realities rarely match perfectly. So the empath stays. They observe longer. They give more chances. They wait for alignment. Not because they are naive, but because they are testing the pattern. And every time the pattern repeats, something inside them adjusts. Not emotionally, structurally. Their perception sharpens. Their tolerance subtly shifts. Their internal distance increases even if their external behavior stays the same. And no one notices when this begins, because it doesn't look like withdrawal. It looks like the same person, just slightly quieter, slightly more measured, slightly less reactive. But internally, the accumulation is becoming undeniable. Not overwhelming, but precise. And this precision is what most people never expect from an empath. Because by the time the empath fully understands what they're dealing with, they're no longer guessing, they're recognizing. And once recognition replaces assumption, something irreversible begins. Not an explosion, a shift. A quiet internal shift that changes how they see everything moving forward. And the people around them rarely notice when that shift happens, because externally, nothing has changed yet. but internally, everything has already started to reorganize. And this is where the pattern deepens, not in a way that's immediately visible, but in a way that quietly restructures every interaction moving forward. Because once the empath begins recognizing patterns instead of reacting to moments, they stop responding to what is said and start responding to what is repeated. What most people don't see is how this changes the emotional dynamic entirely. It looks like the empath is still giving, still understanding, still showing patience. But internally, something has shifted from connection to calibration. They are no longer engaging just to connect, they are observing to confirm. And this is where imbalance begins to take form. Because while the empath is adjusting internally, the other person is adapting externally, not consciously, but behaviorally. People learn what they can get away with, not through logic, but through repetition without consequence. And the empath, without realizing it at first, becomes part of that reinforcement cycle. They forgive quickly. They overlook inconsistencies. They interpret behavior generously. And each of those responses sends a signal, not verbally, but behaviorally. This is acceptable, even when internally it doesn't feel acceptable at all. And this creates a quiet contradiction inside the empath, because what they feel and what they allow begin to separate. It feels like patience, but internally it's pressure. It feels like understanding, but internally it's overextension. It feels like emotional strength, but internally it's accumulating weight. And this is where it begins to cost them, not all at once, gradually, because every time a pattern repeats without being interrupted, it becomes stronger, not just in the other person, but in the dynamic itself. The empath gives, the other adapts. The empath absorbs, the other escalates. The empath stays consistent, the other becomes comfortable. And comfort, when unchallenged, turns into expectation. This is the part most people miss. The empath is not being taken advantage of in a dramatic, obvious way. It's subtle. It's built through small allowances, repeated over time, a tone that crosses a line but is ignored, a behavior that feels slightly off but is rationalized, a pattern that doesn't sit right but is given another chance. And each time, the empath tells themselves the same thing, just slightly differently. Maybe they didn't mean it like that. Maybe I'm overanalyzing. Maybe it will adjust over time. But internally, they're not guessing. They're noticing. And that's the tension. Because the empath sees the pattern clearly, but delays acting on it. Not out of weakness, but out of restraint. They don't want to disrupt prematurely. They don't want to misjudge. They don't want to assign meaning too quickly. So they wait. They observe more. They collect more data. And during that time, the pattern continues. Not because it's hidden, but because it's uninterrupted. And this is where reinforcement becomes almost invisible. The other person doesn't think, I can push this further. They simply feel, this works. And behavior, that works, repeats over and over until it becomes the default. And by the time it becomes the default, the empath is no longer confused about what's happening. They're clear. But clarity at this stage doesn't immediately create action. It creates awareness of cost, emotional cost, mental cost, energetic cost. The empath starts to feel the weight of interactions that used to feel natural. Conversations require more processing. Silences feel heavier. Small inconsistencies feel louder. And yet, externally, they remain composed, still measured, still calm, still seemingly unaffected. Because reacting now would feel delayed, almost irrelevant to the moment. The realization didn't come from one event, it came from many. And that accumulation doesn't express itself impulsively. It consolidates, quietly, internally, until the empath reaches a point where they are no longer trying to understand the pattern. They fully see it, not partially, not emotionally, precisely. And once something is seen that clearly, it can't be unseen. And this is where the realization begins to form, not as a conclusion, but as a shift in perception. The empath starts to understand that their silence, their patience, their willingness to give space was never neutral. It shaped the behavior around them. And this realization doesn't create immediate confrontation, it creates distance. Not physical distance at first, internal distance. A subtle pulling back of emotional investment. A reduction in overextension. A quiet reevaluation of where their energy is going and what it's reinforcing. And this is where the tension changes direction. because it's no longer about what others are doing. It's about what the empath has been allowing, not from blame, from clarity. And that clarity begins to reorganize everything slowly, but with precision. Not outwardly, internally. And this is where the shift becomes undeniable, not because anything dramatic happens, but because the empath stops negotiating with what they already understand. What most people don't see is that clarity for an empath doesn't arrive as a sudden decision. It arrives as a quiet certainty that no longer needs confirmation. The pattern has repeated enough, not once, not occasionally, consistently across different moments, different moods, different contexts. And this is where it begins to solidify, because the empath is no longer asking, what does this mean? They already know what it means. And internally, something stabilizes, not emotionally, structurally. The overthinking slows, not because they stop caring, but because there is nothing left to solve. The replaying of conversations fades, not because they forgot, but because the pattern has already explained everything those moments were trying to reveal. And this creates a very specific kind of silence, not confusion, not avoidance, clarity without announcement. It looks like they're still the same, still calm, still present. But internally, they are number. Longer engaging in the same way. They are no longer trying to interpret inconsistencies. They are recognizing them in real time and adjusting quietly. And this is where detachment begins, but not in the way most people assume. It's not emotional shutdown. It's selective investment. The empath doesn't stop feeling. They stop overextending where the pattern has already been confirmed. They stop explaining what has already been shown. They stop giving energy to dynamics that no longer require interpretation. And this shift is almost invisible to anyone who isn't paying attention, because externally, the empath doesn't announce it. They don't confront impulsively. They don't react dramatically. They simply recalibrate. Their responses become shorter, not cold, just precise. Their presence becomes quieter, not distant, just intentional. Their attention becomes filtered, not withdrawn, just directed. And this is where the dynamic starts to change, not because the empath forces it, but because they stop reinforcing what was never aligned. What once received patience now receives observation without engagement. What once received explanation now receives silence. What once received emotional availability now receives measured distance. And this creates a subtle disruption in the pattern, because the other person, whether they realize it consciously or not, begins to feel the shift. The dynamic that once felt predictable no longer responds the same way. The space that once absorbed behavior now reflects it back without cushioning. And this is where discomfort begins to surface, not in the empath, but in the environment around them. Because patterns rely on consistency to survive. And the empath quietly has removed that consistency, not aggressively, precisely. And internally, this is where a deeper realization settles in, that their emotional depth, their patience, their ability to understand was never the problem. The problem was where it was being placed without filtering. And this realization doesn't create anger. It creates alignment, because now the empath is no longer trying to fix the pattern. They are stepping out of it. Not physically at first, psychologically. They are no longer participating in the same emotional exchanges. They are no longer reinforcing the same dynamics. They are no longer translating behavior into something more acceptable than what it is. And this is where their presence changes in a way that's difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. It becomes grounded, less reactive, less available to inconsistency, less influenced by emotional fluctuations that don't align with behavior, and more importantly, more precise, because the empath is no longer trying to maintain connection at any cost. They are maintaining clarity, and that clarity begins to shape every interaction moving forward, not loudly, but definitively. And this is where the transformation completes itself, not as a visible change, but as a structural realignment that redefines how the empath moves through every interaction that follows. Because what most people expect is a reaction, a confrontation, some clear external signal that something has changed. But that's not how this shift expresses itself. It expresses itself through precision, The empath no longer gives indiscriminately, they allocate, not based on emotion alone, but based on observed patterns. And this is where boundaries emerge, not as walls, but as filters. It looks like they've become more distant, but internally they've become more exact. They are no longer deciding in the moment. They are responding from a refined internal framework built from everything they've already seen. And this changes everything. Because now, behavior is no longer interpreted generously by default. It is evaluated, quietly, consistently, without the need for immediate reaction. What once would have been explained away is now simply noted. What once would have been tolerated, repeatedly is now allowed once, maybe twice, but never unconsciously reinforced. And this creates a different kind of presence. Not warmer, not colder, clearer. The empath begins to operate with emotional precision. They still feel deeply, but they no longer distribute that depth without direction. They still understand others, but they no longer override their own perception to maintain harmony. They still observe, but now their observation informs action, even if that action is subtle. And most of the time, it is. Because the most significant changes don't require explanation. They require consistency. The empath starts showing up differently, less available to inconsistency, less responsive to emotional volatility, less invested in correcting what is repeatedly shown, and more aligned with what is stable, what is reciprocal, what doesn't require constant interpretation. And this is where something important becomes visible, but only to those paying attention. The empath is no longer easy to read, not because they are hiding, but because they are no longer reacting in predictable ways. They don't over-explain. They don't overextend. They don't fill silence with reassurance. They allow space, and in that space, behavior reveals itself without interference. And this is the part that unsettles people the most. Because when the empath stops absorbing, stops adjusting, stops compensating, the dynamic is exposed for what it actually is. Not what